She stood alone in the great hall on her wedding night, her husband's back turned to her as he spoke quietly with his steward. The celebration had emptied hours ago. Candles burned low in their iron sconces, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Serafina still wore her ivory silk gown, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had imagined this night differently. She had imagined him turning, crossing the distance between them, and offering her a single word of warmth. Something small. Something human. But he did not turn. The Duke of Ashford, Julian Ashford, stood with the rigid posture of a man who had forgotten she was there. When he finally glanced over his shoulder, his gray eyes held no softness, only the quiet, practiced duty of a man who had signed a contract. "You should rest," he said. "The journey tomorrow is long." She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. He did not wait to hear them. He inclined his head and left the hall, his boots echoing down the corridor until silence swallowed him whole. Serafina remained motionless, a bride who had become a ghost before the ink on the marriage register had dried. She had known this was a marriage of obligation. Her father's final letter to the Duke, written from his sickbed, had extracted a promise. Julian Ashford owed her family an old debt of honor. Marrying the penniless daughter of a country gentleman was the price of settling it. Serafina had entered Thornwood Hall carrying no illusions of romantic love, but she had carried something far more fragile. She had carried hope. Tiny and foolish, she had believed that shared grief might build a bridge between them. Her father had been his friend once. Surely some ember of that connection still glowed. The weeks that followed taught her otherwise. Thornwood Hall was vast, elegant, and impossibly cold. The stone walls held the chill of centuries, and the servants moved with the silent efficiency of people who had learned never to disturb their master. Her husband rose before dawn, disappeared into estate business, and returned long after she had eaten alone in the echoing dining room. When they passed in the corridors, he offered polite nods. When they sat together at the rare formal dinner, he asked about her comfort as if inquiring after a houseplant. Nothing more. She tried, oh how she tried. She learned his preferences from the housekeeper. She had the cook prepare his favorite dishes. She placed fresh flowers from the garden in his study, hoping he might notice and smile. He never mentioned them. One evening she gathered her courage and waited up for him in the library, a book open on her lap, her heart beating with the desperate wish that he might sit beside her and ask what she was reading. He came in, saw her, and paused. For one breathless moment she thought he might soften. Instead, his expression shuddered. "You should not wait up for me, Your Grace. The hour is late, Your Grace." Not her name, never her name. He took a ledger from the desk and left. She sat there until the candle guttered, the ache in her chest blooming into something sharp and silent. The first public humiliation came at a dinner party hosted by Lady Whitmore, a society matron with a smile like cut glass. Serafina wore her finest gown, a soft lavender silk that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes. She entered on her husband's arm, and for a fleeting moment, the weight of his hand on hers felt like protection. Then the whispers began. "That's the vain girl. Her mother was on the stage, you know, an actress. And now she's a duchess. How the mighty houses have fallen." Ashford looks thrilled, doesn't he? Like a man attending his own funeral. Serafina's cheeks burned. She kept her chin high, her smile fixed, but inside something shrank. Julian did not defend her. He did not even seem to hear. He simply led her to the table and retreated into conversation with the men about crops and Parliament. She was left to navigate the sharp tongues of women who saw her as an intruder, a stain on their pristine world. Halfway through the evening, a dowager countess leaned close. "Tell me, my dear, does your husband speak to you at home? He hardly seems to know you exist." The woman's laugh was a tinkling, cruel thing. Serafina excused herself, walked to the terrace, and stood in the cold night air, trembling. She did not cry. She had learned by now that tears changed nothing. But that night, a door inside her began to close. Back at Thornwood Hall, she sought solace in the forgotten corners of the estate. The east wing housed a neglected music room, its pianoforte covered in dust sheets. She had played as a girl before the years of hardship, before her mother's health faded and her father's debts swallowed everything. She lifted the sheet, sat on the worn bench, and touched the keys. The notes rose, tentative and thin, then grew into a melody that spoke of all the longing she could not voice. Unbeknownst to her, Julian passed by the corridor that evening. He paused. The sound drifted through the heavy oak door, something haunting and beautiful. His hand lifted toward the handle, then fell. He walked on, jaw tight, as if the music were a language he had forbidden himself to understand. Spring arrived, and with it a slow change. Serafina stopped waiting. She stopped setting a place for him at dinner. She stopped asking the servants if he would be home. She stopped listening for his footsteps in the hall. She moved her belongings to a separate suite in the West Tower, a smaller, sunlit room that overlooked the overgrown gardens. The housekeeper, a kind woman named Mrs. Bromley, helped her without comment. The staff had seen this coming. Serafina began to spend her days outdoors. She hired a few local men and women and set to work restoring the gardens that had once been the pride of Thornwood. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused. She wore simple wool dresses and tied a kerchief over her dark hair. The physical labor was a balm. As she dug and planted and pruned, she felt the grief inside her shift into something quieter, something she could carry without breaking. The village beyond the estate gates became her second sanctuary. She visited the parish school and found it in disrepair, with children learning their letters from tattered slates. She used a small portion of her household allowance to purchase new books, slates, and chalk. She began teaching the younger girls herself, sitting on a wooden stool with a child on her knee, pointing to letters. The villagers, initially wary of the new duchess, warmed to her gentleness. They saw that she was not proud. She was simply kind. During these weeks, a figure began to appear at the edges of her days. Dr. Samuel Alden, the village physician, was a widower with a quiet, steady presence. He began stopping by the school to check on the children's health, always with a respectful nod to the Duchess. They fell into easy conversation about the new garden plants, the best remedies for coughs, the simple rhythms of country life. He treated her not as a duchess but as a woman with thoughts worth hearing. His blue eyes held no judgment, only warmth. Serafina, starved for simple human connection, found herself looking forward to his visits. Julian noticed none of this, not at first. He was too absorbed in estate ledgers and the cold, orderly machinery of his life. But then the changes became impossible to ignore. He came home one evening to find the dining room empty, the table set for one. He asked the butler where her Grace was dining. "The Duchess has taken supper in the West Tower, your Grace. She did not expect you." The words landed like a stone in still water. A few days later his cousin arrived. Lord Tristan Ashford was everything Julian was not, charming, laughing, easy with a compliment. He swept into Thornwood Hall with a whirlwind of stories from London, his chestnut hair gleaming, his smile quick. Julian tolerated him because family demanded it. Serafina, lonely and weary of silence, welcomed the company. Tristan admired her garden project. He listened as she spoke about the school. He played duets with her in the music room, his baritone voice blending with her melody. Julian walked past the music room one afternoon and saw them together through the half-open door. Tristan leaned against the pianoforte, laughing. Serafina's head was tilted back, her smile wide and unguarded. It was a smile Julian had never seen. He stood frozen in the corridor, something hot and unfamiliar twisting in his chest. He did not recognize it. He had not felt jealousy in years, not since the dark days after his first love, Elinor, had died in a riding accident that he still blamed himself for. He had locked away all feeling after that, convinced that loving anyone meant inviting loss. Now, watching his wife laugh for another man, the lock began to splinter. He began to watch her. He told himself it was mere observation, but he found excuses to walk past the gardens while she worked. He noticed the way the sun caught the copper threads in her hair. He noticed the dirt on her cheek and the grace of her hands. He noticed her absence from his wing of the house, the way her laughter never reached him anymore. The silence she had once filled with hopeful gestures was now a silence of indifference. It terrified him. One night, unable to sleep, Julian wandered into his private study. He opened a hidden drawer in his desk and withdrew a small canvas, no larger than a book. It was a painting of a young girl sitting in a wildflower meadow, her face turned half away, a book in her lap. The colors were soft, the brushstrokes filled with a quiet joy. He had bought it years ago at a charity auction in London, drawn to the soul in the artist's work. The signature in the corner was tiny, S. Vane. He had never known who S. Vane was. He had simply kept the painting as a secret treasure, a reminder of a beauty he did not deserve. Now, as he stared at it, the truth crashed over him like a wave. The slope of the girl's shoulder, the way her hair fell, the quiet intensity of her posture. It was Serafina. She was the anonymous artist whose work had moved him long before he ever knew her name. He had seen her once at a garden party when she was barely 17, standing apart from the crowd, watching everything with those deep, thoughtful eyes. He had asked someone about her and been told she was practically betrothed to a young baronet. He had believed it, pushed the memory away, and never inquired again. All these years, he had held a piece of her soul in his hands and never known. Guilt and longing collided in his chest. He put the painting away and pressed his palms against the desk. What had he done? He had married the woman whose heart he had admired from afar and then treated her as a stranger. He had let her wilt in his cold house while he nursed old wounds that were never her fault. A second revelation came days later when Serafina was tidying the neglected library. She found a stack of old correspondence tied with a black ribbon. Among the papers was a draft of a letter in Julian's handwriting, addressed to her father before the wedding. She hesitated, then read it. The words blurred before her eyes. "I will not pretend this marriage is born of passion, but I give you my word that your daughter will want for nothing. I will protect her from every shadow. I will ensure her mother is cared for with dignity, away from the cruelty of the gossips. I failed once to keep someone safe. I will not fail again." Tucked behind the letter was a receipt from a private sanatorium in Bath, where her mother, shunned by society for her past on the stage, had been living in comfort these many months. Serafina had believed her mother was staying with distant relatives out of necessity. She had never imagined Julian had secretly arranged it all, sparing her the shame of begging for help. She sank onto a settee, the paper trembling in her hand. All this time she had believed he felt nothing, but he had been acting in the shadows, carrying the guilt of a past tragedy and the burden of a promise he did not know how to voice. The coldness was not hatred, it was fear, broken, terrified fear. She did not confront him, she was not ready. She simply folded the letter, returned it to the ribbon, and walked to the gardens to think. The knowledge changed everything and nothing. She still carried the ache of his rejection. She still needed time to heal. But now she understood that he was not a monster. He was a man buried alive in his own remorse. The harvest festival arrived, the village green strung with lanterns and laughter. Serafina attended, her hair loose beneath a simple wreath of autumn leaves. Dr. Alden was there, and they danced a country reel together, her cheeks flushed with joy she had not felt in months. Tristan was also there, watching with amusement. Julian stood at the edge of the green, half hidden by a large oak tree. He saw Serafina's hand in the doctor's hand. He saw the easy way they moved together. He saw the doctor's gaze linger on her face, with unmistakable admiration. Tristan appeared at his elbow. "She's found her place, hasn't she? The village adores her, and Alden, well, a man would be blind not to notice." Julian's voice was ice. "She is my wife." "Is she?" Tristan replied lightly. "Because from where I stand, cousin, you gave her away long ago." Julian turned and walked into the darkness, his heart pounding with a fear he could no longer name. He had pushed her away so completely that she had built a life without him. And the most painful truth of all was that she seemed happy, happier than she had ever been under his roof. The thought was unbearable. Autumn deepened. Serafina continued her work. Her days full and her nights quiet. She no longer felt the desperate loneliness of those first months. She had found purpose. She had found a version of herself that did not need his approval to breathe. But she did not hate him. She watched him sometimes from her tower window, riding out across the moor, his shoulders set with a weight she now understood. She pitied him, and that pity was a strange, tender thing. One afternoon, returning from the village on foot, she was caught in a sudden storm. The sky turned black, rain lashing sideways, the wind howling across the open fields. By the time she stumbled into the entrance hall of Thornwood, she was soaked to the bone and shivering violently. Mrs. Bromley rushed to her, fussing. Julian appeared at the top of the stairs. His face lost all color. He was beside her in an instant, his hand pressing against her forehead. "She's burning up. Fetch Dr. Alden, now." He lifted her into his arms, something he had never done, and carried her up the stairs himself. She was too weak to protest, her head lolling against his shoulder. He brought her to her room in the West Tower, the room she had chosen over his, and laid her gently on the bed. He did not leave. The fever took hold fiercely. For 2 days, Seraphina drifted in and out of consciousness. Julian stayed by her bedside, refusing food, barely sleeping. He held her hand when she trembled. He spoke to her in low, broken sentences, words he had never dared to say aloud. "I saw you once years ago in a garden. You were reading. I asked who you were. They said you were promised to someone else. I never forgot you. I bought your painting without knowing it was yours. I have it in my study. I have looked at it every night." He pressed her fingers to his lips. "I married you out of duty, but I stayed cold because I was a coward. Elinor died because I let her ride a horse I knew was too wild. I could not protect her. I promised myself I would never care for anyone again because caring meant watching them slip away. But I care, Seraphina. I care so much it is tearing me apart. Please, please come back to me." On the third morning, the fever broke. She opened her eyes to find him slumped in a chair beside her, his dark hair disheveled, his cravat gone, his hand still wrapped around hers. He looked younger in sleep, the hard lines of his face softened. She stirred and his eyes flew open. Gray eyes no longer cold, filled with a desperate, naked hope. Sira, her name, finally her name. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw. She managed a small, cracked whisper. "I heard you in the fever you talked." He closed his eyes, shame washing over his features. "I am sorry for everything, for the silence, for the loneliness, for not seeing you until you were almost gone." A tear slipped down her temple, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of something she had thought was dead. "I read your letter to my father. I know about my mother." He looked at her, startled. "I did not want you to feel indebted. I only wanted to do right by her, by you." She squeezed his hand, the movement weak but deliberate. "You should have told me. You should have let me in." "I did not know how." His voice broke. "I did not know if you could ever look at me without seeing the man who failed you." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, summoning the strength she had built in those months of solitude, she spoke the truth that had taken root in her heart. "I stopped waiting for you, Julian. I stopped because I had to save myself. But I never stopped hoping you might one day turn around and see me." He knelt beside the bed, his forehead resting against their clasped hands. "I see you now. I see the gardens you brought back to life. I see the children you teach. I see the woman you are, not the bride I ignored. I am asking, not for forgiveness in a day. I am asking for a chance to learn to be the husband you deserved from the start." Dr. Alden, arriving later to check on her, observed the scene from the doorway and quietly withdrew. He was a good man, and he had recognized the longing in the Duchess's eyes long before she had spoken of it. He knew where her heart truly lived. The weeks of recovery were slow and strange and beautiful. Julian did not return to his distant routines. He brought her tea himself. He read to her from the books she loved. He walked with her in the garden when she was strong enough, his arm steadying her. They talked, sometimes for hours, about Elinor, about his guilt, about the painting that had unknowingly bound them together. He showed her the canvas, and she wept, not from grief, but from the overwhelming strangeness of fate. He did not push for her affection. He did not demand forgiveness. He simply showed up day after day with a quiet consistency that slowly, gently rebuilt the bridge between them. The ice around his heart had melted, and what emerged was a man capable of a tenderness so profound it left her breathless. One evening, as winter's first snow dusted the windows, they sat in the music room. She played the pianoforte, the same melody she had played in her loneliness. He sat beside her on the bench, not speaking, just listening. When the last note faded, he turned to her. "I loved you too late," he said, his voice thick. "But I will love you every day for the rest of my life if you will let me." She looked at him, at the vulnerability in his eyes, at the hands that had held hers through the fever, at the man who had been so lost and was finally found. She lifted her hand and touched his cheek. "Then start now," she whispered, "and don't ever stop." He kissed her forehead, a gesture so full of reverence that it said more than any passionate embrace could. And in the quiet of that winter night, in the house that had once been so cold, two hearts, scarred and uncertain, began to heal together. The years that followed were not without effort. There were still shadows to face, still moments of old pain, but Thornwood Hall transformed. The garden Serafina had begun flourished under her care, and Julian joined her in the planting, his hands learning the soil as she had learned to trust again. The village school grew, funded by the Duke and taught by the Duchess, and the laughter of children rang through the valley. Tristan visited less often, sensing that the space he had briefly occupied was now filled with a love that needed no audience. And on quiet nights, when the fire burned low, Julian would take out the small painting of the girl in the wildflowers and set it on the mantel beside a miniature of Serafina, a gift she had given him on their second anniversary. Two images of the same woman, one he had loved unknowingly from afar, one he had nearly lost through his own fear. Both now his, not by duty, but by the grace of a second chance he did not deserve. She would lean her head on his shoulder, and he would press his lips to her hair. "Thank you," he would murmur, "for waiting, for leaving, for coming back." And she would smile, that smile he had seen once in a sunlit music room, and she would answer, "I never truly left. I was always here, waiting for you to arrive." In the end, it was not a grand confession or a dramatic sacrifice that saved them. It was the quiet, daily choice to see each other, to stay, to build a love not from perfect beginnings but from honest, broken, hopeful continuations. And that, they both knew, was the rarest, most precious story of all.